Shalom Israel, it's Kazawan, and the name of this video is, do we need to be baptized in water? I'm doing this video because people ask me all the time if they need to get baptized in water or if they need to get baptized all over again in water now that they know the truth. Now, the reason why people ask this question is because some people teach that water baptism is a requirement for salvation. However, when you look into it, water baptism is only symbolic of the spiritual change that takes place when you're truly baptized by the Spirit of the Most High. So let's go into the scriptures to get the understanding. Let's go back to the time of Moses where it all started. This is Numbers chapter 8 and verse 5. It says, "And Yahweh spake unto Moses, saying," verse 6, "Take the Levites from among the children of Israel and cleanse them." So the Most High separated the Levites from the rest of the children of Israel, and he told Moses to cleanse them. Verse 7, "And thus shalt thou do unto them, to cleanse them." Here it is. "Sprinkle water of purifying upon them." So the Most High told Moses to sprinkle water of purifying upon the Levites. In the Hebrew, it says, "Sprinkle the mayam kata'ath," which is sin water. Moses had to sprinkle the sin water, or the water that cleaned away sin, upon the Levites. Now, did the water actually take away the sins of the Levites? No. So we know that this water is symbolic. It's always been this way. The water symbolically cleans you, not literally cleans you. So Moses sprinkled the sin water on the Levites. It says, "And let them shave all their flesh." Again, we're dealing with purity. It says, "And let them wash their clothes," here it is, "and so make themselves clean." Again, the cleansing process by water was symbolic of being spiritually clean. This is Isaiah 1 and 16. This is the Most High talking to Israel. It says, "Wash you, make you clean." So here we see the Most High telling Israel to wash themselves in order to be clean. But watch this. It says, "Put away the evil of your doings from before mine eyes. Cease to do evil." So we see that the Most High is not talking about natural water, because natural water doesn't stop you from being evil, but spiritual water does. See, people get baptized in water all the time, and they never change their lifestyle. So the water isn't sufficient to truly clean you. Watch this. This is Jeremiah 2 and 22. It says, "For though thou wash thee with nitrate, and take thee much soap." See, Israel knew how to clean themselves naturally. But watch this. It says, "Yet thine iniquity is marked before me, saith the Lord God." So the Most High wasn't satisfied with the natural cleaning through water, because that doesn't take away the sins of the people. You can get baptized 40 times in a row and still be wicked, because natural water can't wash away sins. See, the Bible tells us how to truly be cleaned. This is Psalms 119 and 9. It says, "Wherewithal shall a young man clean his way? How can a person be made clean?" It says, "By taking heed thereto according to thy word." So the word is what cleans you. The word renews you. That's how you become a new person, because the word is spirit. This is John 6 and 63. This is YashaYaH talking. It says, "It is the spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing." Here it is. "The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life." So the word gives you life. It cleans you up and it makes you a new person. See, water baptism is symbolic of the word. and the word is spiritual. This is Ephesians 5:25. It says, "Husbands, love your wives, even as YashaYaH also loved the church and gave himself for it." Now, why did YashaYaH give himself? Verse 26, "That he might sanctify and cleanse it." Watch this. "With the washing of water." What water? It says, "By the word." So YashaYaH cleansed Israel through the word, not through water baptism. That's why YashaYaH himself never physically baptized anybody. See, YashaYaH was initiating a new, better system. This is John 4:1. It says, "When therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that YashaYaH made and baptized more disciples than John," watch this, verse 2, "though YashaYaH himself baptized not, but his disciples." See, the disciples were baptizing people because they were using water baptism symbolically as a sign of repentance. But YashaYaH didn't baptize anybody in water. Why? Because again, he was ushering in a new, better system. Now, somebody might say, if that's the case, then why did YashaYaH get baptized? That's a good question. But what we have to realize is that YashaYaH's baptism was different from everybody else's. Remember, water baptism was symbolic of washing away sin. But we know that YashaYaH didn't have any sin to wash away. So his baptism was done for a different purpose. And that purpose was so that the Father could openly declare him to be the Son of the Most High and the Messiah. This is Matthew 3:16. It says, "And YashaYaH, when he was baptized, went up straightway out of the water. And lo, the heavens were opened unto him." Watch this. "And he saw the Spirit of the Most High descending like a dove and lighting upon him." So when YashaYaH came up out the water, the Most High sent his Spirit down and it rested upon YashaYaH. Now watch this, verse 17. "And lo, a voice from heaven saying," here it is, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." So the people that was around, they heard YashaYaH being declared as the Son of the Most High. Now we know that didn't happen to anybody else that was baptized in water. So this is a different situation. This was the Most High anointing YashaYaH with the Holy Spirit so that he could perform his ministry. Watch, this is Acts 10:38. It says, "How the Most High anointed YashaYaH of Nazareth with the Holy Ghost and with power." Watch this. "Who went about doing good and healing all that were oppressed of the devil." How was he doing it? It says, "For the Most High was with him." You see, he was anointed by the Spirit of the Most High to do the things he did. So yes, YashaYaH was baptized in water, but it was for a different purpose. He didn't have any sins to wash away. And now, because of him, our sins are washed away through repentance and obedience to the word. Even John the Baptist understood that water baptism was only symbolic of the true baptism. This is Matthew 3:11. This is John talking to the children of Israel. It says, "I indeed baptize you with water." Watch this. "Unto repentance." So John said, I'm baptizing you and instructing you to repent. In other words, this is symbolic of you being made clean. It says, "But he that cometh after me is mightier than I, whose shoes I am not worthy to bear." Watch this. He, YashaYaH, shall baptize you with the Holy Ghost and with fire. So John understood that his ministry of water baptism was only symbolic of repentance and being cleansed from sin. But YashaYaH came to baptize us with the Spirit and literally cleanse us from our sins. So now the symbolism aspect is no longer necessary because YashaYaH came and literally did the cleaning. How did he do it? This is John 15:3. This is YashaYaH talking. It says, now ye are clean. See that? It says, now ye are clean, meaning truly clean. How? It says, through the word which I have spoken unto you. See that? It's the word that cleanses you, not the water. The water is symbolic of the word. Paul got the same revelation from YashaYaH when he started his ministry. This is 1 Corinthians 1:17. This is Paul talking to the Corinthians. It says, for YashaYaH sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel. See? Paul said YashaYaH didn't tell me to baptize anybody. He told me to preach the gospel. It says, not with the wisdom of words, lest the cross of YashaYaH should be made of none effect. So Paul made it clear that he wasn't sent to baptize anybody in water. He was sent to preach the word. Why? Because it's the word that really cleans you, not the water. This is John 17:17. This is YashaYaH talking. It says, sanctify them through thy truth. Now the word sanctify is the Greek word hagiazo, which means to separate, purify, and cleanse. So YashaYaH asked the Most High to separate, purify, and clean the disciples through the truth. What truth? It says, thy word is truth. So we consistently see throughout the Bible that the word is what cleans you up, not the water. Natural water was never the answer to sin. Now, many people say, if water baptism is no longer necessary, then why was the disciples still baptizing even after YashaYaH died? That's a legitimate question. And the answer is this: because it took time for everybody to get the revelation. It was a transitional period between the water baptism understanding and the spiritual baptism understanding. That's why you don't see anything about water baptism after the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 2, we see Peter baptizing people in water. That's shortly after YashaYaH died. But let's see what Peter said later on when he wrote his letters. This is 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18. It says, for YashaYaH also have once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to the Most High, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit. Verse 19, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison. Verse 20, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long suffering of the Most High waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was a preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls were saved by water. So Peter said that 8 souls were saved by water. Verse 21, the like figure whereunto even baptism does also now save us. So Peter said when Noah and his family was saved by water on the ark, that was symbolic of how baptism now saves us. But watch this. It says, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh. See, Peter said not being dipped in the water, that doesn't save you. It says, but the answer of a good conscience towards the Most High by the resurrection of YashaYaH. You see that? So we see that at this point in Peter's life, he understood that water baptism did not save you. He said you have to have a good conscience towards the Most High. Now, the only way you get a good conscience towards the Most High is to be renewed in the spirit of your mind. That's the real baptism. This is Ephesians 4:22. It says, that ye put off concerning the former conversation, the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lusts. Watch this, verse 23. And be renewed in the spirit of your mind. So the way you think has to change, and water does not change how you think. Verse 24. And that ye put on the new man. How? How do you become a new man? It says, which after the Most High is created in righteousness and true holiness. So the new man is created when you become righteous and holy. And how do we do that? This is Psalms chapter 19 and verse 7. It says, the law of Yahweh is perfect. Now, what does the law do? It says, converting the soul. So the word converts you. The word renews your mind. It says, the testimony of Yahweh is sure, making wise the simple. So that's how you become a new person. When you hear the word and receive the word, it changes you. The Spirit of the Most High deals with you and you become a new person. Now, watch this. This is Ephesians 4:4. Pay close attention to what these verses are saying. It says, there is one body and one spirit, even as ye are called in one hope of your calling. Verse 5. One Lord, one faith, here it is, one baptism. See that? Not two baptisms, one baptism. Now this is very important. There's one baptism. Keep that in mind while we read this. This is Acts 19:1. It says, and it came to pass that while Apollos was at Corinth, Paul, having passed through the upper coast, came to Ephesus, and finding certain disciples, verse 2, he said unto them, have ye received the Holy Ghost since ye believed? So Paul comes across these men, and he asked them if they had received the Holy Spirit since the time that they believed on YashaYaH. It says, and they said unto him, we have not so much as heard whether there be any Holy Ghost. Now watch the question that Paul asked. Verse 3. And he, Paul, said unto them, unto what then were ye baptized? Paul said, well, what type of baptism did you have? It says, and they said, unto John's baptism. Now watch what Paul says. Verse 4. Then said Paul, John verily baptized with the baptism of repentance, saying unto the people that they should believe on him which should come after him, that is, on YashaYaH. So Paul said, yeah, John's baptism was for the purpose of repentance and for people to show their belief in YashaYaH. Now these men already had that baptism, but watch this. Verse 5. When they heard this, they were baptized in the name of YashaYaH. Now wait a second. Let's think about this. These men had already went through water baptism. But verse 5 says that after that, they were baptized in the name of YashaYaH. So what type of baptism is this talking about? It's talking about the baptism of the Spirit. Now remember, Ephesians 4:5 says there's only one baptism. So what is the one baptism that is talking about? It's talking about the baptism of the Spirit. How do we know? Because If it was talking about water baptism, then there wouldn't be any need for the baptism of the Spirit. Again, once you receive the baptism of the Spirit, there's no need for the water. Now watch this. This is Acts 2:38. It says, "Then Peter said unto them, Repent and be baptized every one of you in the name of YashaYaH," here it is, "for the remission of sins, and ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost." So we see that water baptism was for the purpose of remission of sins. Now watch this. This is Romans 3:25. It says, "Whom the Most High have set forth," that's talking about YashaYaH, it says, "to be a propitiation through faith in his blood." Does it say faith in water? No. Faith in his blood. For what purpose? It says, to declare his righteousness, here it is, for the remission of sins that are past, through the forbearance of the Most High. So in Acts 2:38, we see that water baptism was performed as a sign of remission of sins. But in Romans 3:25, we see that faith in the blood of YashaYaH gives you remission of sins. In other words, if you believe that his death was a sufficient sacrifice, then your sins are remitted. Look at this. This is Matthew 26:28. This is YashaYaH talking. It says, "For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many," here it is, "for the remission of sins." So what is this showing us? It's showing us that remission of sins was acknowledged through water baptism. But YashaYaH's death brought in a change. Now we have faith in his blood for remission of sins. We believe that through his death, we have been made clean through faith. The water symbolically cleansed us in the past, but his blood spiritually cleansed us and is still cleaning us right now. This is Revelation 1:5. It says, "And from YashaYaH, who is the faithful witness and the first begotten of the dead, and the prince of the kings of the earth, unto him that loved us," watch this, "and washed us from our sins." How? It says, in his own blood. So here's the question that you have to ask yourself. If YashaYaH washed away your sins with his blood, then why do you still need water? What is the water going to do that his blood didn't do? See, if you still feel the need to be baptized in water, then by proxy, what you're saying is that his blood didn't clean you well enough. And if that's what you're saying, then you're denying his work on the cross, and you're still in sin. Remember, there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, not two, one baptism. And that one baptism is the baptism of the Spirit. So, do you need to get baptized in water, or do you have to get baptized again now that you know the truth? No. The only baptism that you need is the baptism of the Spirit, which comes through the word and faith in YashaYaH. Now, before I end this video, please be advised, all general comments are accepted. If you disagree with something that I say, you have that right. However, if you attack me on a personal level outside of the scriptures and resort to name calling and childish, unspiritual behavior, your comment will be erased and you will be blocked. Also, if you disagree with something that I teach, that's fine. You have the right to comment about it. But if you make a comment in disagreement and you don't use scriptures to support what you're saying, I won't block you, but your comment will be erased because I deal with scriptures, not opinions. Now, to the sincere Israelites who watch my videos, I'm not talking to y'all. I appreciate you guys for taking the time out to watch and listen. But I'm talking to these immature, non-spiritual trolls who always have something to say. But when you go to their page, 9 times out of 10, they don't have one single video teaching anything. But yet, they want to come on my page and teach in the comment section. I'm not allowing that anymore. So, with that being said, as always, I hope that somebody got some understanding from this video. And with that, I say, Shalom.